The heat came first. It always did out here in this particular stretch of the Mojave, where the desert didn't just warm you, but press down on you like a living thing, heavy and deliberate, as though the land itself was trying to flatten everything beneath it into dust and memory. By 10 in the morning, the asphalt on Route 66 was already soft enough to leave boot prints. By noon, the horizon had dissolved into that familiar shimmer, that wavering liquid mirage that made the distant mountains look like they were breathing. And by 3 in the afternoon on this particular Thursday in July of 2004, the thermometer nailed to the outside wall of the Copperhead Saloon read 111 degrees, and nobody who lived out here was surprised by that number at all. The Copperhead sat just off the highway near Needles, California, a squat, windowless cinder block building that had no business still standing after 40 years of desert sun, flash floods, and the kind of hard use that left marks on walls, the way hard living left marks on faces. The sign out front had lost two of its letters sometime in the 90s, and nobody had bothered to replace them. The parking lot was unpaved gravel, bone white and glittering in the afternoon glare. There were no decorative plants, no welcome mat, no attempt whatsoever to signal warmth or hospitality. The Copperhead didn't advertise itself. It didn't need to. The people who came here already knew where it was, and the people who didn't know where it was were generally better off staying lost. Inside, the air was marginally cooler, kept that way by a pair of ancient window units that rattled and wheezed with the determination of something that refused to die, despite having every reason to. The lighting was dim, a combination of fluorescent tubes behind the bar and the scattered glow of neon beer signs mounted on the cinder block walls. Budweiser, Coors, Miller Genuine Draft. Their red and blue light pooled on the scratched mahogany surface of the bar and bled softly into the darker corners of the room, where the booths were old cracked vinyl the color of dried blood, and the tables were sticky with the residue of decades of spilled drinks and cigarette ash. The jukebox in the corner was playing a Merle Haggard song, something slow and aching about a man who had made too many wrong turns to find his way back. Three regulars occupied stools at the bar, older men with sun-weathered faces and the patient, unhurried posture of people who had nowhere else to be. Behind the bar, moving with the quiet efficiency of someone who had worked this exact space for more years than she cared to count, was Bev Aldridge. Bev was 48 years old, though she could have passed for either 40 or 60, depending on the hour and the light. She was lean and angular, with short, silver-streaked hair she kept pulled back and a pair of gray eyes that missed very little. She had run the Copperhead for 11 years since her husband walked out and left her with a mortgage, a liquor license, and exactly no sympathy from anyone. She had turned all three into something, not something glamorous, not something she would have chosen if the world had offered her a wider menu, but something solid, something that was hers, something that stood up in the heat and the wind and kept standing. She was polishing a pint glass when she noticed, in the way she had developed over years of working this room, that the booth in the far corner had gone quiet. This wasn't unusual. The booth in the far corner was always quiet. It was the darkest spot in the Copperhead, tucked into an alcove where the light from the nearest neon sign barely reached. And for the past 3 months, it had been occupied on most afternoons by a 10-year-old girl who sat with her knees pulled up to her chest and her head bent over a battered spiral notebook. The girl's name was Wren Aldridge. She was Bev's niece, her late brother-in-law Warren's daughter, and she had been living with Bev since April, since the morning that Warren Aldridge had finally lost the long, quiet war he had been fighting against something none of the doctors could name with any precision. They called it organ failure. They listed the contributing factors in careful clinical language. But Bev had sat in that hospital room and watched her brother-in-law die, and what she saw leave his body at the end was not something any medical chart had a column for. It was relief. It was the unmistakable, heartbreaking relief of a man who had been carrying something unbearable for a very long time and had finally, after 15 years, been allowed to set it down. He had left behind a daughter. He had left behind almost nothing else. Wren was small for her age, with her father's dark brown hair that corkscrewed at the ends, no matter what you did with it, and eyes the color of strong coffee that were always moving, always cataloging, always taking quiet inventory of whatever room she was in. She was not by any observable measure a dramatic child. She did not throw fits or demand attention or fill silence with noise the way some children did. She was watchful. She was still. She had a stillness that belongs to children who have learned early that the world is not always safe, and that the best way to navigate it is to see as much as possible while being seen as little as possible. She sat in the corner booth and she drew. The notebook she used had originally been purchased for a different purpose. It was a standard school spiral college ruled with a blue cardboard cover that she had covered in her own artwork over the months she had been staying with Bev. The cover was dense with drawings, muscle cars, and desert landscapes, and the detailed, intricate architecture of imaginary machines. But the drawings were only on the front half of the notebook. The back half was different. The back half belonged to her father. She didn't draw in the back half. She didn't even open it very often. But she knew it was there, those pages pressed together at the back of the book, where her father's handwriting covered every inch of space, in a cramped, urgent script that looked nothing like the careful, measured penmanship he had used for everything else in his life. She had read enough of it to understand that the words were not meant for her, not exactly. They were the words of a man trying to evacuate something from inside himself, trying to get it out of his body and onto paper because keeping it inside had become more than he could manage. She didn't fully understand what they meant. She was 10 years old. But her father had been very specific in the last weeks about two things. The first was the notebook. He had pressed it into her hands one afternoon when the light in his hospital room was going orange and long, when the nurses had stepped out and it was just the two of them. He had held both her hands in his and said with a clarity that cut through the fog of his medication like something cold and sharp, "If anyone ever comes looking for the silver skull, you give them this." The second was the necklace. Wren reached up now without thinking about it and wrapped her fingers around the pendant beneath her shirt. It had become a reflex over the past 3 months, the way some children reach for a stuffed animal or a blanket. The pendant was heavy for its size, solid silver hanging on a thick steel chain that had left a faint green mark on the back of her neck in the first week before her skin adjusted to it. The design was intricate and strange, a winged skull biting down on a broken motorcycle piston, rendered with a level of craft that seemed excessive for something meant to hang under a shirt and never be seen. But the detail that made it singular, the thing that her fingers always found without looking, was the right eye socket of the skull. Set into the silver was a small ruby, or what had been a ruby. It was chipped now, half its surface gone, the remaining stone the color of old garnets, in certain lights and almost black in others. And on the left wing, running diagonally across the feathers, there was a crack in the silver itself, a flaw in the original casting that someone had clearly decided to keep rather than recast. It gave the pendant the feeling of something that had survived something it had no business surviving. Her father had put it around her neck on the same day he gave her the notebook. He had said, "This is the most important thing I ever took." And then he had caught himself and looked at her with those tired eyes that were also somehow afraid, and said, "I mean kept. The most important thing I ever kept." She had known even at 10 that he had meant the first word. She didn't know what it meant, but she knew it mattered. And she wore it every day under her shirt where it pressed against her sternum and reminded her with its weight that her father had trusted her with something he hadn't trusted anyone else with in 15 years. She was pressing her pencil too hard against the page. She could feel the resistance building the way the graphite started to drag instead of flow, and she tried to ease up, but the frustration of the afternoon, the heat, the loneliness, she couldn't quite name the low-grade ache that had settled into her chest since April and hadn't fully lifted all of it, was running down her arm and into her hand, and she couldn't quite control it. The pencil snapped. It broke cleanly right at the point, leaving a gray smear across the drawing she had been working on. She stared at it. Then she set it down on the table and exhaled slowly and reached up with both hands to rub her face. When she brought her hands down, she caught the chain with her fingers, and the pendant swung out from under the collar of her faded t-shirt and hung in the open air for the first time all day. She didn't notice. She was looking at her ruined drawing. At exactly 3:15, the floor began to vibrate. It started as something you felt before you heard it, a low-frequency tremor that moved up through the floorboards and into the soles of your feet, like the earth itself was clearing its throat. The three regulars at the bar stopped talking. Bev's hands stilled on the glass she was polishing. The Merle Haggard song continued oblivious. Then the sound arrived. It came from the highway rolling in from the west, and it built the way a thunderstorm builds, starting as something distant and abstract and becoming within the space of 30 seconds, something enormous and immediate and impossible to ignore. It was the sound of engines, not one engine and not two, but many a whole chorus of high-displacement V-twin motors running at road speed, the kind of sound that you felt in your back teeth and your sternum simultaneously. The kind of sound that rewired your nervous system before your brain had time to process what it was hearing. The three men at the bar had their money on the counter before the bikes even pulled off the highway. They were moving toward the back door with the practiced speed of people who had rehearsed this exact exit in their minds many times without ever consciously deciding to. One of them left a half-full glass of beer behind. He didn't go back for it. Bev set down the pint glass she'd been polishing. She pressed both palms flat on the bar surface and breathed through her nose and watched the front door. Through the propped open frame, she could see them pulling into the gravel lot one after another, the dust rising around them in a massive tan cloud that swallowed the sunlight and turned the afternoon apocalyptic. They rode in a tight formation that had nothing accidental about it, the geometry of people who had ridden together long enough to move as a single organism. The machines themselves were extraordinary. Custom-built Harley-Davidsons with lowered frames and extended forks and paint that caught the desert sun in ways that standard factory finishes never could. Deep blacks and burnt chromes, and one particular bike near the front painted a red so dark it was almost the color of dried blood. Bev counted 24 bikes before she stopped counting. She had seen the San Bernardino chapter before. Not often and not here specifically, but she knew the patch. She knew the reputation. These were not weekend riders, not accountants on rented Harleys playing at something on Saturday afternoons. These were men for whom the motorcycle was not a hobby, but a grammar, a complete and sovereign language, through which everything that mattered was expressed. The cuts they wore, the sleeveless leather vests stiff with the accumulated patches and pins of years of membership, were not fashion. They were records, histories. They told you everything about a man if you knew how to read them. The man who came through the door first made the doorframe seem like a design inadequacy. He was 6 feet 4 inches tall and built along proportions that suggested his ancestors had been doing heavy manual labor for many consecutive generations. His shoulders were wide enough that he turned slightly sideways as he came through the entrance, not because he had to, but because he had learned that the habit prevented broken door frames. He was somewhere in his middle 40s, though the sun and the years and whatever else had happened to him had made an imprecise map of his face. His forearms, visible below the rolled sleeves of a faded black shirt, were covered in faded prison tattoos that had blurred at the edges over time into something resembling the bas-relief on old stone monuments. A scar ran from his left earlobe down the side of his neck and disappeared beneath his collar, the color and texture of old wax. His name in the world that existed outside of legal documents and court records was Cord. Cord Mercer, Sergeant-at-Arms of the San Bernardino chapter. A man whose reputation for methodical, efficient, unambiguous authority had preceded him across state lines for the better part of 2 decades. He stepped into the Copperhead and stood for a moment just inside the door, letting his eyes adjust from the afternoon glare to the dimness of the bar, reading the room in the automatic comprehensive way that men in his position learn to read rooms or stop being in his position. His gaze swept the bar, the booths, the pool tables, the back hallway. It paused briefly on Bev. He gave her a nod. Not warm, not cold, professional. "Afternoon," he said. His voice was a deep, unhurried baritone that carried without effort. "Cord." Bev kept her own voice level. She had learned over years of running this bar that the tone you set in the first 10 seconds of an interaction like this one was the tone you lived with for however long the interaction lasted. "What can I get you?" "Pitchers of Coors," he said. "Keep them coming." The rest of the chapter filed in behind him. They were loud, and they were not trying to be anything else, claiming the pool tables and the prime booths with the casual, unself-conscious authority of people who understood that space belonged to whoever was willing to occupy it most completely. The noise level in the Copperhead climbed rapidly. Pool balls cracked, laughter erupted. Someone fed money into the jukebox, and the Merle Haggard song gave way to something louder and less mournful. Flanking Cord as he settled against the bar were two men who moved with the alertness of people whose job description included anticipating problems before they became visible. The first was called Hatch Pruitt, a blocky, square-jawed man in his early 50s with a shaved head in the hands of someone who had spent a significant portion of his life doing things with those hands that he would not be asked about in polite company. The second was Vex Tarlow, younger leaner, with sharp features and quick dark eyes, and the compressed, coiled energy of a man who was always looking for something to be angry about and rarely had to look very hard. For 20 minutes, everything in the Copperhead proceeded along lines that Bev could manage. She poured beer. She kept her expression neutral. She did not look toward the corner booth unless she absolutely had to. And when she did, the glance she sent Wren was clear and unambiguous. Stay still, stay invisible. Stay exactly where you are. Wren, for her part, had understood the instruction before it was given. She had watched the bikers come in with the careful, unblinking attention she brought to everything, cataloging faces and movements and the precise geometry of who stood where and why. And she had made herself as small as she knew how to make herself, pulling her knees to her chest and letting the shadow of the alcove fold around her like something protective. She was looking at the broken pencil on the table. She was thinking about her father. She thought about him often in the disorganized way that grief works in children, not in sustained waves of sadness, but in sudden discontinuous flashes, specific memories arriving without warning and departing just as abruptly. His hands, which had been the careful hands of an accountant, precise and controlled. The way he made coffee in the mornings with a concentration that seemed excessive for the task. The way he sometimes sat at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning, when he thought she was asleep, writing in the notebook with the focused, urgent desperation of someone trying to outrun something that was right behind him. She had understood even then that he was afraid of something. She had never known what. She reached up and rubbed her face again, and her hands caught the chain, and the pendant swung out, and the chipped ruby caught the blue edge of the Budweiser sign mounted on the wall 6 feet away, and threw a small, brilliant point of red light across the scarred tabletop. Cord Mercer had finished his second pint. He pushed off the bar and began making his way toward the back of the saloon, toward the hallway where the restrooms were. He moved through the room with the unhurried, deliberate gait of a man who owned whatever floor he was walking on. His heavy boots connected with the hardwood in a steady metronomic rhythm. He passed the first booth, the second. He was approaching the dark alcove at the back when something in his peripheral vision snagged him the way a nailhead snagging a thread can unravel something far larger than itself. He stopped. He turned his head very slowly toward the corner booth. At first, it was only the light that had caught his attention, that small point of red there, and gone in an instant. But then he saw the source of it, a pendant, heavy silver hanging from a chain around a small girl's neck, and the shape of it, even across the dim distance of the bar, hit him somewhere below. Conscious processing somewhere in the part of the nervous system that stores the things you cannot afford to forget. He did not move. He did not breathe. The blood left his face with a completeness that was startling, evacuating from his sun-weathered skin, as though his body had received news his mind was still catching up to. For a man who had survived bar fights and prison riots and high-speed chases through 3 different states, for a man whose reputation was built in significant part on his imperviousness to surprise. He stood in the middle of the Copperhead Saloon and looked like someone had reached into his chest and removed something structural. His voice, when it came, was barely above a murmur, but in the way of certain voices it carried anyway. Hatch. Hatch Pruitt looked up from the pool table, cue in hand. Yeah. Kill the jukebox. There was something in Cord's tone that made questions irrelevant. Hatch set down his cue, walked to the jukebox, and pulled the power cord from the wall socket. The silence that followed was the kind that has physical weight. Every man in the Copperhead registered it immediately. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Pool cues were lowered. Heads turned toward Cord with the automatic trained attention of people who had learned that when their sergeant-at-arms went quiet in a certain way, the correct response was to go quiet yourself and wait. Cord walked toward the corner booth. He was a large man and he moved large, his shadow preceding him across the floor. And as he approached the alcove where Wren sat, he seemed to occupy more and more of the available space until he was standing directly over the small girl, and his shadow had swallowed her completely. Wren looked up. She went very still. Cord's eyes were not on her face. They were on the pendant, the silver skull with the chipped ruby eye, and the cracked left wing hanging in the open air against her faded t-shirt. His right hand came up slowly, and he extended one finger, a thick, scarred, calloused finger, that was trembling visibly and pointed directly at the pendant. "Where did you get that?" The silence in the Copperhead Saloon was so complete that Wren could hear the refrigerator compressor humming behind the bar 40 feet away. She could hear her own heartbeat. She could hear the small, tight sound of her own breathing. Across the room, Bev had already dropped her bar towel. She was moving. She covered the distance between the bar and the corner booth in the time it took Cord to draw a slow breath, and she positioned herself at the edge of the table, putting her body between the enormous man and her 10-year-old niece with the specific total commitment of someone who had made a decision about what mattered and was not revisiting it. "Cord," her voice was steady, a remarkable achievement under the circumstances. "Back off, she's my niece, she's a child. She doesn't know anything." Cord raised his left arm, extended it sideways like a gate, and stopped her without looking at her. The gesture was not violent. It was simply immovable. "I'm not going to hurt her, Bev." His voice had taken on a quality she had not heard from him before, something rough and cracked like stone, subjected to forces greater than it was designed for. "But I need to see that necklace, right now." Wren's eyes moved between the massive man standing over her and her aunt standing beside her. She read both of their faces with the careful attention she brought to reading everything. She registered Bev's fear, which was real and unperformed. She registered Cord's face, which was not angry. She understood that, clearly not angry in the way she had braced for, not the cold predatory fury she had seen flicker across Vex Tarlow's face when he first walked in. What she saw on Cord's face was something else entirely. Something that looked around the edges like grief. Like a man who had been waiting a very long time for news and had just received it and did not yet know if it was the worst kind or the best kind only, that it was the true kind. She made a decision. She reached up with both hands, lifted the heavy silver chain over her head, and placed the pendant on the scarred wooden table between them. The sound it made when it landed was small. The effect was not. Cord reached down and picked it up. The pendant, which had seemed substantial in Wren's small hands, looked almost delicate in his palm. He held it in the spill of light from the neon sign overhead, and his face underwent a series of changes that were not fully translatable into language. The way certain things that happen in the body are too complex and too layered to be captured by words. He knew this object. He had known it for the better part of his life. He had last seen it 15 years ago on his older brother's neck on a man named Cal Mercer, known throughout 3 states by a name that had been earned rather than given, Iron Cal. Founding president of the San Bernardino chapter. The man who had built something from nothing in the dry heat of the California desert in the early 70s, who had taken a collection of restless, displaced men and given them a structure and a purpose and a belonging. The man who had ridden out into the Mojave Desert on a November night in 1989 to meet with a rival syndicate about a disputed territory claim and had simply never come back. They had searched. God, they had searched. For months, the chapter had turned the desert inside out, combing canyon after canyon, checking every abandoned mine shaft between Needles and Blythe. They had put out inquiries through every network they had. They had applied pressure in every direction that seemed promising. They had found nothing. No body, no motorcycle, no trace of Iron Cal Mercer anywhere in the physical world. The assumption had hardened into certainty. Over time, the way assumptions do, when there is nothing to challenge them, the Viper Syndicate had ambushed Iron Cal, killed him, and disposed of the evidence. That assumption had started a war that lasted 3 years and cost the chapter enormously in money, in members, and the kind of attrition that changes an organization's character permanently. And with Iron Cal had disappeared something else, something that struck at the chapter in a different but equally significant way. Warren Aldridge had vanished the same night. Warren, who had kept the chapter's books for 4 years, who had managed the legitimate businesses, the auto shop, the real estate holdings, the bar revenues, the thousand small transactions that made up the chapter's visible face. Warren, who had been quiet and nervous and precise, and who had always seemed slightly out of place in this world, a man of ledgers and tax codes navigating a world that ran on different rules entirely. Warren, who had disappeared on the same night as Iron Cal and left behind an open safe and a missing $500,000. For 15 years, the chapter's narrative had been coherent and simple. The Vipers killed Cal, and a terrified accountant used the chaos to steal the war chest and run. The coward's calculus. Take the money and the confusion vanish, start over somewhere else. Cord had believed it. He had been furious enough to believe it, and to sustain that fury for 15 years without it dimming significantly. He had made certain internal promises about what would happen if Warren Aldridge was ever located. He stared at the silver pendant in his palm, the winged skull, the broken piston, the chipped ruby in the right eye socket, the crack in the left wing that Cal had refused to have repaired because he always said the flaw was what made it real. Cord had held this object in his hands before. He had held it the last time he saw his brother alive. "Dutch," Vex Tarlow said from somewhere behind him. Using Hatch's road name out of old habit, his voice pitched low and tight. "You seeing what I'm seeing?" "Shut up, Vex." Cord didn't turn around. Hatch Pruitt had come up behind Cord and was looking over his shoulder at the pendant, and the expression on his square, weathered face had shifted from the neutral alertness he usually wore to something more complicated. Recognition, an awareness of the weight of the moment that went beyond anything words were going to help with. Cord set the pendant down on the table. He looked at Wren directly for the first time. Really looked at her. The dark eyes, the brown hair that corkscrewed at the ends, the shape of her jaw. "Girl," he said, his voice dropping to something almost private, "I'm going to ask you one more time, and I need you to tell me the absolute truth. Where did you get this necklace?" Wren met his gaze. She was afraid, genuinely and physically afraid, her heart hammering against her sternum and her hands pressed flat against her thighs beneath the table to keep them from shaking visibly. But she was also her father's daughter, and her father had told her exactly what to do if anyone ever came looking for the silver skull. And she understood, looking at this man's ruined, grieving, enormous face, that this moment was the moment he had been talking about. "My dad gave it to me," she said. Her voice was steady. It surprised her. "Before he died, he said it was the most important thing he ever kept." Cord's jaw tightened. "Your dad." He said it slowly, feeling the weight of each word. "When did he die?" 3 months ago, Wren said. "In April, he was sick." "What kind of sick?" Wren looked at the pendant on the table. "Not the kind with a name," she said after a moment. "He said he had something in him that the doctors couldn't see. He said it was the ghost of a man in the desert that never let him sleep." The bar was completely silent. Cord stared at her. His massive chest rose and fell slowly. Behind him, Vex Tarlow took a step forward. "Give us a name, kid," he said, his voice sharp and impatient. "Who's your father? What's his name?" Wren looked at Vex. Then she looked back at Cord. She made a second decision. "Warren," she said. "Warren Aldridge." The name landed in the silence of the Copperhead Saloon like something dropped from a great height. Vex Tarlow made a sound in the back of his throat that was not quite a word. He turned away and his fist came down on the nearest pool table hard enough to jump the balls in their rack. 15 years, he said, and the words were compressed to almost nothing by the force of what was behind them. 15 years and the rat's kid walks in here wearing Cal's necklace. "Vex," Cord's voice was a command. He took the money, Cord. He took the money and he left Cal out there, and now his kid is sitting in a bar in Needles wearing proof of it around her neck. I said, shut your mouth. Cord turned then, and whatever was in his face made Vex go still. This is my call, my blood, my brother. You don't speak again until I tell you to. Vex held his gaze for 2 full seconds, which was longer than most men managed. Then he stepped back. Cord turned back to the table. Wren was watching all of this. She had not looked away from any of it. She had watched Vex's explosion and Cord's command and the submission that followed, and she had filed it all away in the comprehensive way she filed everything. And she had noted the expression that crossed Vex Tarlow's face in the moment after he stepped back, when his eyes cut sideways to Hatch Pruitt, with something in them that was not quite submission and not quite agreement. Something calculating. Something that was already looking past this moment toward the next one. She filed that too. Bev had her hand on Wren's shoulder now. Cord looked at them both. Your father, he said, his voice dropping further. Did he ever talk about where he came from? Before you, before wherever you were living? No, Wren said. He didn't talk about before. Did he say anything about the necklace? About where it came from? He said it was a reminder, Wren said. He said some debts can't be paid, but they can be carried. And he said if anyone ever came looking for the silver skull, I was supposed to give them this. She reached across the table past the pendant and pulled the battered spiral notebook from the edge of the bench where it had been sitting all afternoon. She held it for a moment. The weight of it was the weight of her father's handwriting, filling the back half of it, 15 years of sleepless nights, and guilt and Bible verses crossed out in black ink, and a map drawn from memory of a place in the Mojave Desert that she had never been, and hoped until about 20 minutes ago she would never need to find. She understood in the way that children sometimes understand things before they have the language to explain the understanding, that what she was doing by pushing this notebook across the table was irreversible, that it would change things, that the moment her father had been preparing for without telling her he was preparing for it was this one right here in the dim heat of her aunt's bar on a July afternoon in 2004. She pushed the notebook across the table to Cord Mercer. He looked at it, he looked at her, he picked it up. The cover was Wren's, covered in her drawings of cars and machines and imaginary landscapes. He turned it over, opened it to the middle, and the world of the notebook divided itself cleanly into before and after. Her careful pencil sketches on one side, and on the other the frantic, pressure-scarred handwriting of Warren Aldridge. The pages filled top to bottom and into the margins with words that had clearly been extracted from inside a man by force. Cord read. The bar stayed silent. Nobody moved. He turned pages slowly. His breathing changed, became heavier, more deliberate, as though he was managing something that wanted to get away from him. Hatch stood at his shoulder and read along without speaking. Then Cord reached the page with the map. It was 2 full pages drawn in the obsessive detail of someone who had committed a specific geography to memory and never been able to let it go. The ruins of the old Iron Mountain pumping plant, a dry wash, a cluster of Joshua trees, a rocky outcropping shaped unmistakably like an anvil, and beneath the anvil an X drawn with such force that the pen had nearly gone through the page. At the bottom in block letters that seemed to have been written with the last reserves of something 34 degrees 8 minutes north, 115 degrees 7 minutes west. And below that one final line, I buried the iron, I buried the gold, I kept the silver. Cord closed the notebook. He stood there for a moment with it in his hands, looking at nothing in particular, the way a man looks when he is somewhere inside the machinery of his own understanding, as it reconfigures itself around a new and devastating truth. Then he looked up. Hatch, he said. His voice had gone completely flat, all the emotion drained out of it, and replaced with the focused calm that precedes decisive action. Get the pack ready. Hatch nodded once and turned away. We're riding to Iron Mountain. Cord tucked the notebook into the inside pocket of his leather cut. He reached out and picked up the silver pendant from the table and wrapped the chain around his fist. He looked at Bev, not at Wren, at Bev. "I'm leaving 2 men at the door," he said. "You and the girl stay in this bar until I come back. If what's in that notebook is true, there'll be no trouble. If it's not—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. He turned and walked toward the door, his boots on the hardwood floor, the only sound in the room. Within 3 minutes, the Copperhead Saloon shook to its foundations as 24 engines turned over simultaneously in the gravel parking lot outside. The roar built and built until it was less a sound than a physical condition, a total environmental fact. And then it began to move eastward out onto Route 66 and into the white afternoon heat, and the sound diminished by degrees until it was the distance, and then only the distance, and then nothing at all. The nothing it left behind was enormous. Bev stood behind her niece with both hands on the girl's shoulders and watched the dust settle in the parking lot through the propped open front door. Outside, 2 men in leather cuts had taken up positions on either side of the entrance, with the unhurried patience of people prepared to wait as long as necessary. Wren sat in the corner booth and looked at the place on the table where the pendant had been. Then she looked at the empty space in front of her where the notebook had been. She had done what her father told her to do. She pressed her palm flat against the table and felt the scratches in the old wood beneath her fingers. The accumulated record of 40 years of glasses and keys and elbows, and the 10,000 ordinary moments that had happened in this bar before this one. And she breathed slowly the way her father had taught her to breathe, when things felt too large to fit inside your chest, and she waited. The desert at night was a different country. During the day, the Mojave announced itself with a kind of brutal, indifferent spectacle. The blinding white light, the shimmering heat, the vast emptiness that pressed against the eyes and demanded to be reckoned with. But after the sun went down, it became something else entirely. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in the space of 2 hours, the kind of drop that felt less like cooling and more like revelation, as though the heat had been a disguise all along. And this was the desert's true face, cold and black and infinite and absolutely silent, in the way that only genuinely empty places can be silent. The 24 motorcycles ran east on Route 66 and then cut south on a secondary road that wasn't much more than a suggestion in the sand, 2 pale tire tracks pressed into the hardpan by decades of occasional use leading toward the dark mass of the Iron Mountain Range that rose against the star-filled sky like a broken jaw. Their headlights carved through the darkness in shifting, sweeping beams, illuminating brief and fragmentary pictures of the landscape. A Joshua tree with its arms raised in what looked like alarm. A rusted highway marker bent nearly parallel to the ground by some ancient collision. The bleached skeleton of something large that had died beside the road long enough ago that even the vultures had finished with it. Cord rode at the front. He always rode at the front. It was his position and his right. But tonight there was something different in the way he held himself on the bike. A quality of forward lean that was about more than aerodynamics. A physical expression of the urgency running through him like current through wire. He had not spoken since they left the parking lot of the Copperhead. Hatch Pruitt, riding 2 positions back, had watched him from behind and read what he could in the set of those wide shoulders, and had said nothing himself because there was nothing useful to say. The notebook was in Cord's inside chest pocket, pressed against his ribs. He could feel it with every breath. He was thinking about his brother, not about what might be waiting at the coordinates in that notebook. Not yet, his mind wasn't ready to go there directly. Instead, it went sideways into memory, which is where the mind goes when the present is too large and too consequential to be faced head-on. He was thinking about Cal as he had known him before the weight of leadership had settled permanently onto those broad shoulders. Cal teaching a 16-year-old Cord to ride in the parking lot of an abandoned drive-in theater in San Bernardino, patient in a way that surprised everyone who knew him, because patience was not a quality Cal Mercer was widely associated with. Cal building the chapter from nothing in the mid-70s, recruiting men one at a time, with a combination of personal charisma and absolute moral clarity about what the Brotherhood was and was not going to be. Cal refusing 3 separate times to expand into narcotics when other chapters had made fortunes doing exactly that, because his read on where that road led was precise and correct, and he was willing to take the financial hit rather than travel it. Cal, the night before he disappeared, sitting on the back step of the chapter house in San Bernardino, with a bottle of beer in his hand and his silver pendant catching the porch light, talking to Cord about something minor, some small internal dispute that needed managing. And Cord had been only half listening because he was tired, and because he had no way of knowing that this was the last real conversation they would ever have. He had never stopped being angry at himself for that, for the half listening, for the fact that the last exchange he had with his brother was about something he couldn't even fully remember now. 15 years. The pendant was in his cut pocket, wrapped around his fist until the chain cut into his palm. He had put it there after he left the bar, not wanting to look at it while he was riding, not wanting the distraction of it. But he could feel it the way you feel a bruise without pressing on it, a constant, low-level awareness that it was there. Warren Aldridge's daughter. A 10-year-old girl with her father's dark eyes and her father's instinct for stillness, sitting in a corner booth with a notebook full of her dead father's guilt and a pendant that had no business being in this world still. He pushed the thought aside and focused on the road. They reached the coordinates at 11:47 at night. The ruins of the Iron Mountain pumping plant had been abandoned since the 1940s, and the desert had spent the intervening 6 decades doing what the desert does to everything that stops fighting back, pulling it apart, slowly reclaiming the materials, returning the man-made to something closer to the elemental. What remained were the concrete foundations and partial walls of 3 structures, the rusted hulks of machinery too large and too heavy to have been worth salvaging, and a great deal of scattered debris that had been arranged by wind and time into patterns that looked almost intentional, almost like the remnants of something that had meant something once. The motorcycles stopped in a rough semicircle, their headlights all pointed inward, creating a circle of illumination in the middle of which the desert floor was visible in pale relief. The engines cut off one by one, and the silence came flooding back, absolute and immediate. Cord dismounted. He stood for a moment and looked at the landscape around him, matching it against the map in the notebook which he had memorized during the ride. The dry wash was there exactly as drawn, a shallow depression running roughly north to south, its sandy bed glowing faintly in the headlight spill. The cluster of Joshua trees was there, 5 of them, in a rough grouping 40 yards to the east, their silhouettes bizarre and angular against the stars. And there beyond the Joshua trees, visible even in the darkness, because of the way the moonlight caught the pale granite surface, was the rock. It was unmistakable. A massive, irregular boulder that rose about 8 feet from the desert floor and tapered toward the top in a shape that bore a genuine resemblance to the flat face of an anvil. Cord had passed through this area a dozen times in his life and had never noticed this rock specifically because there was no reason to notice it, because it was just a rock in a desert full of rocks. But Warren Aldridge had noticed it. Warren Aldridge had stood in this spot 15 years ago in the dark alone with a dead man's orders in his ears and the sound of retreating gunfire fading into the distance, and he had noticed this rock and chosen it as the landmark that would anchor everything else. Cord walked toward it. The chapter followed at a distance. Nobody asked questions. Nobody needed to. The men of the San Bernardino chapter had ridden with Cord Mercer long enough to understand the grammar of his silences, and what this silence was saying was clear enough. Stay back, give room, let this happen the way it needs to happen. Cord stood in front of the anvil rock. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a folding trench shovel, a military surplus item, the kind of compact, heavy-duty tool that spent most of its life unused and was useful for exactly the situations where you were glad you had it. He unfolded it, locked the blade into position, and stood for a moment with it in his hand, looking at the ground in front of the rock. Then he started digging. The desert floor here was hard-packed, compressed by decades of sun and the absence of rain into something that resisted the shovel blade with a dull metallic authority. Cord put his weight into it, driving the blade with the heel of his boot, working in the methodical, unhurried way of someone who understands that the ground will yield eventually to sufficient force applied consistently over sufficient time. There was no shortcut, there was only the work. The rest of the chapter stood in a wide circle, smoking cigarettes in the cold air, watching. Nobody offered to help. They understood without being told that this was not help that was being asked for. The sound of the shovel biting into the earth and the dry whisper of dirt being turned over were the only sounds in the desert for a long time. Back at the Copperhead Saloon, the two men Cord had left at the door had not moved from their positions. They sat on the front step like features of the landscape, unhurried and patient. And the interior of the bar was quiet, in the way that spaces go quiet, when the thing that was filling them has been removed, and what remains is the shape of its absence. Bev had locked the front door from the inside. She had poured herself a measure of bourbon that she hadn't touched. She was sitting on the bar stool nearest to the corner booth, close enough to Wren to be comforting, without being so close as to be smothering, which was the precise calibration she had been trying to maintain with her niece for 3 months and had not always achieved. Wren had not moved from the corner booth. The broken pencil was still where she had left it. She had not looked for another one because drawing had stopped being the point several hours ago. She was thinking. In the hour since the chapter had left, she had done the kind of thinking she did best. The quiet, comprehensive, uninterrupted thinking that she could only do when nobody was looking at her and expecting anything from her. She had been replaying the scene in precise detail, her memory for detail being one of the things about herself she had noticed and cataloged without anyone else pointing it out to her. She replayed it the way you replay something important, not just once, but over and over, looking for the things she might have missed on the first pass. She had not missed Vex Tarlow. She had been watching Vex throughout the whole encounter in the way she watched everyone steadily and without appearing to, and what she had seen in him was not what she had seen in Cord Mercer. Cord's response to the pendant had been grief massive and unperformed, the involuntary physical expression of a man confronting something he had believed lost forever. Even his anger, when it surfaced, had grief underneath it, was driven by grief, was shaped by grief, the way a river is shaped by the land it runs through. Vex's response had been different. Vex had looked at the pendant with the expression of a man doing rapid arithmetic. His anger, when it came, had been real enough, but underneath the anger, there had been something that didn't fit the picture of a loyal chapter member confronting evidence of a 15-year-old betrayal. There had been a quality of calculation in it, a looking ahead quality, as though he was less concerned with the past than with the implications of the present for his own future. She had watched him during the minutes before the chapter wrote out, while Cord was tucking the notebook into his cut and giving final instructions, and she had seen Vex Tarlow position himself near the payphone at the back of the bar and exchange a look with one of the other men, a look that lasted less than a second, but that she had caught and held in memory like something pressed between pages. She had also, in the noise and movement of those final minutes, heard him say something to the man beside him. She had heard it, cataloged it, and spent the past several hours turning it over like a stone in her hand. He had said quietly enough that it was clearly not meant for general consumption. If the money's really out there, it doesn't need to make the return trip. She was 10 years old, but she understood exactly what that meant. Hatch Pruitt was sitting at the bar with a beer he was barely drinking, and she had been studying him too. Hatch was not Vex. Hatch's version of the evening had been Cord's version, shock and gravity and the careful steadying presence of someone who understood that the sergeant-at-arms needed space to process something enormous. Hatch was loyal, she was fairly certain of this. But Hatch's loyalty was to Cord specifically, and what she was less certain about was what Hatch would do if Vex moved in a direction that Cord hadn't anticipated and wasn't here to respond to. She unfolded herself from the booth and went to the bar. Bev watched her come the way Bev watched everything she did, with that particular mix of love and wariness that had characterized their 3 months together. "You want something, honey?" "A pencil," Wren said. Bev found one under the counter. Wren took it back to the booth and opened the notebook to a fresh page near the front, well away from her father's pages in the back, and began to write. She was not writing a story or making a list. She was writing an address. It was a specific address, a place her father had mentioned more than once over the years. Always in passing, always in the offhand way that people mention things they're not trying to highlight, but that surface anyway because they're attached to something larger. A warehouse on the eastern edge of Needles, an old agricultural storage facility that had been converted to commercial use and then abandoned when the business that used it failed. Her father had mentioned it in the context of storage, of things being kept somewhere safe, of the general philosophy of keeping important things in places that were difficult to find by accident. She was not certain there was anything there. She was fairly certain there wasn't. Her father's letter in the notebook had been explicit about where things were buried, and the warehouse wasn't part of it. But she wrote the address down with enough specificity to be convincing, and then she waited. She didn't wait long. Vex Tarlow's patience had limits that Cord's patience did not have. Within 20 minutes of the chapter's departure, she felt the quality of his presence in the room change the compressed energy in him, finding a direction, and she watched from her peripheral vision as he moved toward the hallway at the back of the bar, where the payphone was mounted on the wall next to the restroom doors. She had been ready. The notebook was on the table in front of her, open to the page where she had written the address. She held it at what she had calculated was exactly the right angle, the writing visible from the hallway entrance, but not obviously displayed the kind of thing you might notice if you were paying close attention without appearing to be, which was precisely the kind of attention Vex Tarlow paid to everything. She let him get almost to the hallway entrance before she looked down and noticed the open page and reacted with what she hoped was convincing alarm, pulling the notebook toward her and flipping it closed with a speed that was just a fraction too obvious, just visible enough to register as someone trying to conceal something they didn't want seen. She did not look up to check if he had noticed. She went back to drawing. A muscle car this time, something with large rear wheels and a long hood, the kind of car her father had sometimes sketched on napkins when they were sitting in diners together, back when he still had the steadiness in his hands to draw. 4 minutes later, Vex Tarlow went to the payphone. She couldn't hear what he said. The conversation was brief, his voice low, and the distance and the ambient noise of the refrigerator compressor and Hatch's occasional movement on the bar stool made it impossible to make out words. But she could hear the tone, the clip-directed efficiency of someone communicating specific information rather than having a conversation. He was on the phone for less than 3 minutes. When he came back to the bar, the compressed energy in him had changed shape. It had been coiled before, restless, looking for direction. Now it had one. Wren closed the notebook and went back to waiting. At the Anvil Rock cord was 3 feet down. The shovel work had become easier as he went deeper the surface layer of compressed hardpan, giving way to softer strata beneath. And he was moving in a rhythm now, the methodical bite and turn and throw that his body had found and locked into the kind of physical automaticity that frees the mind to go somewhere else while the body handles its business. His mind had gone to the letter. He had read it once in the bar, the cramped, urgent handwriting in the back of the notebook, and the words had lodged in him the way shrapnel lodges, not cleanly, not with clear edges, but in a way that would take careful work to address. He didn't know yet what he believed. He knew that a dead man had put his daughter in a bar and needles with a pendant and a notebook and instructions to wait for someone to come looking, and that this was either the most elaborate and patient deception he had ever encountered, or it was the truth. He knew that the pendant was unquestionably Cal's. He knew that the map in the notebook led here, and that here was exactly the kind of place you would go if you had something to hide in the Mojave Desert far out of the way and without obvious landmarks except for that one distinctive rock. He knew that in a few feet one way or another he was going to stop wondering. The shovel hit something that wasn't rock. The sound was different, a dull, dense thud that vibrated up through the handle into his palms, and he stopped immediately. He went down to his knees in the hole, which was now deep enough to require this, and he cleared the dirt from the surface below, with his bare hands brushing it away carefully, and what emerged was the top face of a heavy steel box, military surplus, the kind designed to survive conditions that would destroy ordinary materials. It was heavily rusted. The rust was the deep orange red of metal that has been wet and dry many times over many years. But the seams were intact. The lock hasp had corroded but held. Cord looked at it for a moment. Then he looked up at Hatch, who was crouching at the edge of the hole, and something passed between them in the shared language of men who have known each other long enough to communicate without words. Cord did not reach for the box. He moved 18 inches to the left and began to dig again. He had read the letter. He knew what else was supposed to be here. The second material he found was softer than the first, and he found it faster, only about 20 inches down. And when he recognized the texture of it under his fingers, he stopped using the shovel entirely and went back to his bare hands. He worked slowly, carefully brushing the dirt away with a gentleness that would have surprised anyone who knew him only by reputation. The canvas was rotted almost to nothing. It came apart in fragments under his hands, disintegrating at the touch, leaving behind the shape of what it had been wrapped around, rather than the material itself. He brushed and cleared and brushed and cleared, and the desert dirt gave way degree by degree, and what emerged into the beam of Hatch's flashlight was black leather stiff with age and the compression of 15 years under the earth, and then the gleam of a silver buckle, tarnished almost to black, and then the unmistakable white and red of a Hell's Angels patch, faded and fragile, but present, still there, still legible after all this time. Cord sat back. He sat in the dirt at the bottom of the hole he had dug with his own hands, and he looked at what was in front of him, and the sound that came out of him was not a word, and not quite a cry, and not quite anything with a name in the standard vocabulary of human expression. It was the sound of 15 years of not knowing ending, of a question that had been open so long it had become part of the architecture of a life finally irrevocably closing. Above him, the chapter stood in silence. Hatch had his hat off. Several of the others had removed their sunglasses despite the darkness, a gesture that meant the same thing here, that it meant everywhere, that something was being acknowledged, that a moment was being given the space it required. Even the men who had barely known Iron Cal Mercer, who had joined the chapter in the years after his disappearance, and knew him only through his reputation and the stories of older members, understood what they were witnessing. They stood in the desert cold and they looked down at their sergeant-at-arms sitting in the dirt with his brother, and they gave it the silence it deserved. Cord did not ask for help climbing out of the hole. He climbed out the way he had climbed in, with the self-sufficiency that was as much a part of him as the scar on his neck. And he stood at the edge, and he looked down at the dark shape in the earth below, and he breathed slowly and said nothing. Then he took the crowbar that Hatch was already holding out toward him, and he went to the steel lockbox. He drove the flat end of the crowbar under the rusted hasp and leaned his full weight onto it, the metal groaning under the pressure, the rust cracking in small, sharp reports. It took 3 serious efforts before the hasp gave way with a sound like a gunshot in the desert quiet, and then the lid was free. He opened it. The flashlight beam swept across the interior. The money was in vacuum-sealed plastic bags stacked with the neat, precise organization of an accountant, each bag dense with tightly packed currency. 15 years in a sealed military-grade container in the dry desert air had preserved them almost perfectly. They looked like they could have been packed the previous week. There were 9 bags. Nobody did the arithmetic out loud. Nobody needed to. Resting on top of the stacked bags was a thick manila envelope wrapped in 3 separate layers of heavy plastic sheeting and sealed with tape that had dried and cracked at the edges but held. Cord picked it up. He stripped the plastic away with his fingers, working through each layer deliberately, and extracted from the innermost wrapping a stack of papers held together with a rusted binder clip. The top page was a letter. The handwriting was the same handwriting he had seen in the back half of the notebook, the same cramped, urgent, pressure-heavy script. The date at the top was November 14, 1989. Cord stood up. He walked to the nearest motorcycle headlight and stood in its beam, and the desert spread out around him in every direction, and the stars above were extravagant and indifferent in the way that stars in the desert always are. And he held the letter up to the light. The chapter gathered close without being asked. They gathered the way men gather when something significant is happening, and there is no longer any point in maintaining the fiction of ordinary distance. Cord's voice, when he began to read, was level. It cost him something to keep it level. The cost was visible in the muscles of his jaw and the careful deliberateness of each breath. If you are reading this, it means the guilt finally killed me, and my child found a way to give you the map. I need you to understand what happened. Not for my sake. I don't deserve anything for my sake. For the sake of the man in the ground beside this box. Cord cleared his throat. Cal and I were riding back from Barstow that night with the cash from the quarterly collection. We got ambushed on Route 66, 14 miles east of Needles by Viper Syndicate riders. There were 10 of them. They had been waiting. Someone had told them we were coming, told them the route, told them the timing. I did not know this at the time. I only understood it later, much later, sitting in the dark, in states whose names I won't write down, putting the pieces together. Hatch made a sound in the darkness. Cord kept reading. Cal told me to ride into the canyon and hide. He turned his bike around and went back toward them alone. I heard the gunfire. It lasted nearly 4 minutes. When it stopped, I waited in the canyon for another 10 minutes the way he told me to. Then I went back. Cord's jaw tightened. He kept his voice level by main force. He had killed 4 of them. The others had gone. He was in the road. He was badly hurt. I tried to get him onto my bike, tried to tell him I could get him to a hospital in time, but he wouldn't let me. He said the ATF surveillance had been running for 6 weeks, and if he died in a hospital, the feds would be there within the hour and the chapter's money would be confiscated before anyone could move it. He said the chapter needed the money more than it needed his funeral. He told me to dig. He told me to bury the cash and bury him with it, and take the pendant and bring it to you when the time was right, when the heat was off, when I had enough courage. Vex Tarlow, standing at the edge of the headlight circle, said nothing. His face was very still. I buried my president in the dark desert ground, and I ran. I changed my name and I moved east, and I lived a small, frightened life for 15 years, and I never touched the money, and I never stopped hearing his voice. He gave me the pendant to prove to you that what I'm telling you is the truth, that his last orders were given freely and followed faithfully by a man who was terrified and imperfect, and who failed in every way except the one that mattered most. The chapter's money is intact. Every dollar. I kept my promise to the only man who ever treated me like I was worth trusting. Cord lowered the letter. He stood in the headlight beam of his motorcycle on the floor of the Mojave Desert at 2 in the morning, and he did not speak for a long time. The wind moved through the Joshua trees at the edge of the light and made a dry whispering sound. Somewhere in the middle distance, a coyote called once and was not answered. The chapter waited. In the silence, Cord folded the letter carefully and put it in his inside chest pocket next to the notebook, and he stood with his hand pressed flat against his own sternum for a moment, as though checking that it was still functioning, still doing what it was supposed to do despite everything the night had put through it. For 15 years, they had believed that Warren Aldridge had stolen from them and fled. For 15 years, the story of Iron Cal's death had been a story of ambush and betrayal and a cowardly accountant who used the chaos for his own gain. That story had powered a war. That story had shaped everything about who the chapter had become in Cal's absence. The bitterness of it, the unresolved anger of it, the wound that had never closed because there was never any resolution to close it. And the real story was this: a terrified man ordered by his dying president to do an impossible thing had done it imperfectly, had run when he should have stayed, had lived in hiding when he should have found the courage to come back, but had done the essential thing, had kept the money safe, had kept the secret, had sent his daughter into the world with the means to deliver the truth when he was no longer able to deliver it himself. A 10-year-old girl in a corner booth had pushed a notebook across a table. Hatch's phone buzzed in his jacket pocket. He looked at the screen and his face changed the brow, dropping the jaw, tightening into a configuration that Cord had seen enough times to recognize immediately. He looked up. "It's Decker," he said. Decker was the prospect they had left as a secondary watch outside the Copperhead. "He says Vex made a call from inside the bar. 3 trucks just pulled up on the lot. He doesn't recognize the plates." The desert silence pressed down around them. Cord looked at Hatch. Then he looked slowly and with great deliberateness at the empty space beside the fire where Vex Tarlow had been standing. The space was empty. Vex was at the edge of the headlight circle, phone in hand, body turned slightly away from the group in the posture of someone who has just been told something they were expecting to hear. Cord did not speak. He turned and walked to his motorcycle. He kick-started it on the first attempt. The engine came to life with a roar that split the desert night and brought the rest of the chapter to attention immediately. He was already turning the bike toward the road when he said without raising his voice, without needing to, "We're going back." The trucks arrived at the Copperhead at 12:41 in the morning. Wren heard them before she saw them as a vibration through the floorboards, though different in character from what she had heard that afternoon. Where the Hells Angels had announced themselves with the full-throated operatic roar of custom engines running at road speed, these vehicles came quietly, the muffled rumble of stock pickups driven with deliberate restraint, the sound of people trying not to be heard, which was in its own way louder than any amount of engine noise. She was already watching the front window when the headlights swept across the parking lot gravel. 3 trucks. American-made dark-colored mid-90s models with a kind of unremarkable profile designed to attract no attention. They pulled in without urgency and parked in a loose triangle formation that left the front door of the Copperhead clearly accessible from multiple angles. The engines cut off simultaneously. The headlights died. For a moment, nothing moved. Then the truck doors opened and men got out, 6 of them, and even in the poor light filtering through the Copperhead's dusty front window, Wren could read the shape of the situation from the way they moved. They moved like men who had arrived at a place they had been given instructions about, men executing a plan that someone else had formed, carrying themselves with the specific confidence of people who believed the difficult part had already been handled and that what remained was simply collection. The 2 men Cord had left at the door were on their feet and positioning themselves before the trucks had fully stopped. She watched them move, and she watched the 6 men from the trucks, and she tried to calculate the arithmetic of what was about to happen. Hatch Pruitt had been off his bar stool before the headlights fully cleared the window. He crossed to the front door with the direct, purposeful stride of someone who had assessed the situation and reached conclusions. He stopped at the door and looked out through the gap, taking inventory. Then he turned back into the bar. His eyes found Wren immediately. This was the moment she had been preparing for, without fully articulating to herself that she was preparing for it. She had been sitting in the corner booth since Vex made his phone call, running and rerunning the variables, trying to map what was likely to happen next, and where the points of leverage were, and what a 10-year-old girl in a lock bar in Needles, California could actually do about any of it. She had arrived at a limited but specific answer. Hatch crossed the room in 7 strides and crouched down at the edge of the booth so his face was closer to her level, which struck her as an unexpectedly considerate thing for a man of his size and history to do. "You need to go to the back," he said. His voice was low and without panic, which she appreciated. "The kitchen all the way through, there's a storeroom. You and your aunt go in there, and you do not come out until I come and get you personally. You understand me?" Wren looked at him steadily. "Are those Vex's people?" Something moved across Hatch Pruitt's face. Not surprise exactly, more like the recognition of something he had half expected, but was still mildly startled to encounter. He looked at the 10-year-old in the corner booth and made a small adjustment in how he was looking at her. "Go to the storeroom," he said. "Is Cord coming back?" "Go to the storeroom, Wren." She went. Bev was already moving from behind the bar, having read the situation from the window, with the same efficiency that 15 years of running a roadside bar in the Mojave had given her. She took Wren's hand, and they went through the door behind the bar into the kitchen, past the industrial grill and the prep surfaces, and the deep fryer that hadn't been used since Tuesday, and through the second door at the back into the storeroom, which smelled of cardboard and old cooking oil, and the particular institutional cleanliness of surfaces that are scrubbed regularly but never quite come clean. Bev pulled the door shut behind them. The storeroom had no window. The sounds that reached them were muffled and directionally unclear voices from outside rendered into tones and volumes without content, the occasional specific impact of something solid against a hard surface. Bev sat on an overturned produce crate and put her arm around Wren, and Wren let herself be held, which was something she didn't always do. She was thinking about the address she had written in the notebook. In the storeroom's darkness, running back through the sequence of events, she tried to assess whether what she had done had worked the way she intended or whether she had miscalculated. The address she had written was real. The building it described, the old agricultural warehouse on the eastern edge of Needles, was real. Her father had mentioned it specifically enough and repeatedly enough over the years that she was confident the detail was solid. What she was not confident about was whether Vex had sent his people there or here or split them between both locations, and the arrival of 3 trucks at the Copperhead was not the outcome she had been working toward. She had been trying to redirect, not concentrate. She pressed her face against her aunt's shoulder and breathed slowly and thought. The muffled sounds from outside continued for several minutes, and then changed in quality, the voices becoming more concentrated and directive. And then there was a period of relative quiet, and then there was a sound that was not muffled at all, a sharp crack from somewhere near the front of the building that her body registered before her mind classified it. Bev's arm tightened around her. They sat in the dark storeroom and waited. Cord came off Route 66 onto the Copperhead's access road at a speed that the road's surface was not designed to accommodate, and did not particularly care about the distinction. Behind him, the chapter ran in tight formation, the headlights of 23 motorcycles creating a moving wall of light that swept across the desert scrub on either side and illuminated the dust cloud their own passage was raising. He saw the trucks before he reached the lot. He saw them, and he read the configuration in a single comprehensive assessment, and the calculations that followed happened in the part of his mind that operated below the level of deliberate thought, the part that had been trained by years of exactly these situations into a kind of automatic tactical fluency. 3 trucks, 6 men visible, 2 prospects holding the perimeter at the door. Hatch's bike still in the lot, meaning Hatch was inside. Meaning Ren and Bev were inside. He brought the bike to a stop in a spray of gravel and was off it before it had fully ceased moving and walking toward the cluster of men near the entrance, with the quality of forward momentum that has no interest in what might be in its way. The 6 men from the truck saw him coming. Cord recognized none of them directly, but he recognized the type with the precision of long experience. These were not active chapter members, not of the San Bernardino chapter or any affiliated chapter he knew. They had the look of men who had been in that world at some point and had been removed from it either by choice or by circumstance, and who had retained enough of the vocabulary to know how to present themselves without having any of the actual standing that the presentation implied. Vex's people. The thought arrived with a cold clarity that he had been building towards since Hatch read him Decker's message in the desert. On the ride back with the wind and the engine noise filling everything around him, in the Mojave pouring past on either side in the darkness, he had done the accounting. He had taken every piece of available information, the things he knew and the things he suspected, and the things that were only patterns without certainty yet, and he had laid them out in the orderly, systematic way that his mind organized problems of consequence. And what he arrived at was a picture that was not complete, but was complete enough. Vex Tarlow had known on the night in 1989 where Cal and Warren were going. Vex had been on the periphery of the chapter, then a prospect with access to chapter house conversations, not trusted with the details of the Barstow run, but close enough to the rooms where those details were discussed to have assembled the picture from fragments. And Vex was exactly the kind of man who, when he assembled a picture, immediately began calculating what it was worth. Whether Vex had made a direct call to the Viper Syndicate or whether the information had traveled through intermediate steps, Cal's final letter had made one thing clear. Someone had told the Vipers the route and the timing. And 15 years later, when a 10-year-old girl in a corner booth revealed that the war chest was not gone, but buried, Vex's arithmetic had updated itself with the same automatic efficiency it had always had. $500,000 intact in a desert lockbox was a different kind of opportunity than a 15-year-old grievance. And Vex had made a phone call. Cord stopped 10 feet from the nearest truck. The 6 men had arranged themselves in the loose, casually aggressive configuration of people who have been told that the numbers favor them and that the situation is essentially under control. They were looking at the motorcycles pulling into the lot behind Cord with an attention that was trying to be steady and not entirely succeeding. Vex Tarlow had positioned himself between the trucks and the door. He turned as Cord approached, and his face in the harsh wash of combined headlights was difficult to read the practiced expressionlessness of a man who has spent years in situations where showing what you were thinking was a liability. Cord, he said. His voice had the careful neutrality of someone trying to establish that nothing irregular was happening and that there was a reasonable explanation for everything present. Cord looked at him for a long moment without speaking. Then he reached into his inside chest pocket and withdrew the folded pages of Warren Aldridge's letter. He held it at his side. I read Cal's letter tonight, he said. His voice was conversational, almost quiet. Out loud to the whole chapter. Everybody heard it. You want to know the part that stayed with me? Vex said nothing. Something was shifting behind his eyes, the calculation running the arithmetic updating in real time. The part where Cal said someone told the Vipers we were coming, Cord said. Someone who knew the route, the timing, someone close enough to the chapter house to hear a conversation that was only supposed to happen between three people. He paused. Cal and Warren and whoever drove the backup vehicle to Barstow that week. The parking lot was very quiet. The six men from the trucks were understanding by degrees that the situation they had arrived to was not the situation they had been described. 15 years. Cord continued still, even still conversational. I spent 15 years believing a dead man had stolen from us. From Cal. I spent 15 years wrong and 15 years angry at the wrong man. He folded the letter and returned it to his chest pocket. Warren Aldridge buried my brother and kept his money safe for 15 years. Every dollar. Kept it for the chapter the way Cal ordered him to. He looked at Vex directly. Meanwhile, the man who actually sold us to the Vipers was riding with us the whole time. Vex moved first. He was faster than a man of his age, and Bill had any right to be the compressed, coiled energy that had always characterized him releasing all at once. Cord was faster. Vex hit the gravel and did not get up, and the six men from the trucks looked at each other and then at the 23 members of the San Bernardino chapter who had spread across the parking lot behind Cord, and they made the correct calculation about what to do next, which was nothing. Two of them tried anyway brief and arrived at the same conclusion by a less comfortable route. Hatch Pruitt came through the front door of the Copperhead. During the final moments of it, assessed what he saw and nodded once at Cord with the expression of a man whose read on the situation has been confirmed. They didn't get inside, Hatch said. Decker and Ortiz held the door. Cord looked at Decker and Ortiz, the two prospects who had been left at the entrance. They were both standing, both upright, both wearing the expressions of men who had just passed a test they hadn't known they were being given. Cord looked at them for a moment in the way that constituted acknowledgement in the grammar of this world, then turned and walked through the front door of the Copperhead Saloon. The bar was exactly as he had left it, which struck him as both obvious and somehow remarkable. The jukebox in the corner, the neon signs, the scratched mahogany surface of the bar, and the cracked red vinyl of the booths, all of it unchanged. The world inside this room had simply waited while the world outside it went through the upheaval it had gone through. He walked through the bar and through the door behind the counter and into the kitchen and stood in front of the storeroom door. He knocked, a silence on the other side brief and assessing. "It's Cord," he said. The door opened. Bev came out first, putting herself in front before she knew what she was stepping into. She saw his face, and some of the tension in her own face shifted, not gone, but reorganized into something she could manage. Behind her, Wren. The girl stepped out of the storeroom and stood in the kitchen light and looked at him with those dark, steady eyes that he had been seeing in his mind during the ride back. She was still wearing the empty chain around her neck, the steel links lying flat against her t-shirt where the pendant had been, and the absence of it was visible as a specific detail in a way that presences sometimes are not. Cord looked at her for a moment. "You set the trap yourself," he said. It was not quite a question. Wren was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded, small and careful. "The address in the notebook," he said. "You wrote it to pull Vex's people somewhere else." "I didn't know if it would work," she said. "I thought it might send them away from here. I didn't expect them to split and come here too." Cord looked at her for a long moment. The kitchen light was harsh and fluorescent, And in it, the 10-year-old girl in the faded t-shirt and the empty chain looked very small and very tired and entirely completely herself. "Where'd you learn to think like that?" he asked. Ren looked at the floor. "My dad taught me to watch people," she said quietly. "He said the most important information is what people show you when they think you're not paying attention." The silence in the kitchen changed quality entirely. Cord said after a moment, he was right. He turned and walked back out through the bar. After a beat, Bev guided Ren after him. The Copperhead's main room felt different from how it had felt at any earlier point in the evening. The chapter was filtering back in through the front door, and the energy that had characterized their earlier occupation of the space, the loud, expansive, casually domineering energy of a group of men claiming territory, had changed into something quieter and more internal. They moved to the bar and the booths without the performance of it. They were men who had ridden to the desert and come back carrying something they hadn't had before, a specific knowledge that changes the shape of everything surrounding it. Hatch had positioned himself behind the bar. Bev let it go. He was pouring without being asked, and nobody was complaining. Cord walked to the corner booth. He stood at the edge of it and looked at the table where the pendant had been lying 6 hours ago, the silver skull catching the neon light with that single chipped red eye. He reached into his cut pocket and unwrapped the chain from his hand. The pendant swung free, catching the Budweiser sign's blue glow in exactly the way it had caught it that afternoon when Ren's hands had inadvertently freed it from beneath her shirt. He set it on the table. He sat down across from the empty bench and looked at the pendant lying there on the old scarred wood and said nothing for a moment, letting the weight of the night settle into its proper arrangement around him before he spoke. Ren came and stood at the edge of the booth. Bev was behind her, one hand resting lightly on the girl's shoulder, present without intruding. Ren looked at the pendant on the table. She looked at Cord's face. She was reading him the same way she had read him all evening, taking inventory of the man across from her, and what she read now was different from what she had read at any earlier point. The grief was still there. It was not the kind of grief that resolves itself in a single night. It was the settled, permanent kind that simply becomes part of the landscape of a life. But alongside it, or perhaps underneath it, there was something that had not been there before. Resolved was too clean a word for what had happened, but it was the direction things were pointing. Cord looked at her. "Your father wasn't a thief," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, the baritone stripped of everything that wasn't essential. "He wasn't a coward either. Not when it mattered. A coward would have spent the money. A coward would have built himself a new life somewhere and tried to forget the whole thing and spent the rest of his years making it work. Your father spent 15 years carrying something that would have broken most men, keeping a promise to a dying man in the desert. And he kept it perfectly. Every dollar, every detail. He kept the promise better than the man he made it to had any right to expect." He paused. "He was the most loyal man my brother ever trusted." Ren was very still. "He was scared," she said. It was not a defense exactly, more like a fact she needed to contribute to the accuracy of the record. "He was scared all the time. I could always feel it in him, even when I was little, and didn't have a word for what I was feeling." "I know," Cord said. "Fear and loyalty aren't opposites. Sometimes they travel together for a very long road. Sometimes the most loyal thing a man ever does is the thing he was most afraid to do." He looked at the pendant on the table. Cal knew that about Warren. That's why he gave him the pendant. Not because Warren was the bravest man in the room. Because Cal trusted him to do the right thing even when everything in him was screaming to run. And Warren did. He ran, yes. But he never betrayed the trust. Not once in 15 years. The Copperhead had gone still in the way it only does when something large has passed through it and left everything rearranged. Cord reached out and pushed the pendant across the table toward Ren. She looked at it. She looked at him. Something moved across her face, an uncertainty, a question she was not sure she had the standing to ask. "Iron Cal gave it to Warren as proof of his final orders," Cord said. "Warren gave it to you as proof of his love. It was never mine to take back." He held her gaze steady. "It belongs to you. It has always belonged to you. Wren reached out and picked up the pendant. It felt the same as it had always had, heavy and warm from being carried the edges of the winged skull, sharp under her fingertips, the chipped ruby eye rough, where the smooth facets had broken away into something more irregular and somehow more honest. She turned it over in her hand once, and then lifted the chain over her head and let it settle around her neck, and the pendant dropped against her sternum with the familiar weight of something that had been missing and was now restored. She did not tuck it under her shirt. Cord watched her leave it out in the open air, hanging visible against the faded fabric, and something in his face shifted slight but legible to anyone paying close enough attention. He placed his hand on top of her head. The hand was enormous. The knuckles scarred the palm, calloused from 40 years of engine work and the particular manual labors of his life. And it rested on the crown of the girl's dark corkscrew hair with a gentleness that was the more striking for the contrast with everything else about him. "You wear that silver proud," he said, "and if anyone ever asks you where you got it, you tell them Warren Aldridge gave it to you. And you tell them the San Bernardino chapter said nobody gets to touch it." He took his hand away and stood up. He stood at the edge of the booth for a moment, looking at the girl who had walked into his life 6 hours ago, carrying 15 years of her dead father's secret around her neck, and a notebook full of guilt in a corner booth, and who had, through the simple act of trusting a frightening stranger with the truth, and then trusting her own mind when it mattered, set something free that had been imprisoned since before she was born. He walked to the bar. Hatch was there, and several of the older members' men who had known Cal personally, who had been part of the chapter in the years before his disappearance, and who had spent the ride back from Iron Mountain in the same interior territory that Cord had been moving through. They looked at him as he came to the bar, and he looked back at them, and what needed to pass between them passed in the wordless way that things pass between people who have been through enough together. He reached for the glass Hatch had poured without being asked. He held it. "We bring him home," he said. His voice was quiet and carried anyway. "We do this right. We contact anyone who needs to be contacted, and we give them the truth, and we bring Cal home, and we put him in the ground the right way with the chapter around him." He set the glass down without drinking from it. "And then we figure out what comes next." Nobody argued. The chapter's response to Cord's voice when it had this quality was not argument. It was the readiness that comes from trust accumulated over years of shared evidence. The knowledge that when this man said a thing in this particular way, the thinking behind it had been done with care, and the direction it pointed was sound. Hatch nodded once. Cord turned back to the room. Wren was still in the corner booth. Bev had slid in beside her, and they were sitting close together in the cracked red vinyl with the dim light falling across them. The woman in her late 40s who had built something real from the materials her life had given her, and the 10-year-old girl with the silver skull resting visibly against her sternum, and her father's coffee-colored eyes, looking at the middle distance where people look when they are somewhere inside themselves, processing something too large for the available vocabulary. Outside, the desert was beginning to lighten. It happened almost imperceptibly at first, the absolute black of the Mojave night beginning to differentiate at its eastern edges into something that was slightly less than black, a shade that existed in the narrow spectrum between darkness and the suggestion of what was coming. The stars near the horizon faded by degrees, not extinguished, but absorbed, pulled into the growing pale wash of approaching dawn. Cord stood at the front door and watched it. He was thinking about the chapter meeting they would hold in the coming days and what would need to be decided about the money. Cal's letter had been explicit that it belonged to the chapter, that it had always belonged to the chapter, that Warren's entire 15-year act of preservation had been in service of returning it to its rightful place. There was no ambiguity there. But there were decisions to be made about what portion of it would be set aside for a different purpose, the purpose that had been forming in his mind since the moment he stood up from the earth at Anvil Rock and looked down at his brother's resting place for the first time. A marker, something permanent and correctly situated at Iron Mountain in the exact spot that the desert and Warren Aldridge together had kept for 15 years as a kind of accidental monument. Something that said a man was here and that what he stood for did not disappear when he went into the ground. He thought about what he would say to the chapter in the days ahead. The things that needed to be said clearly and on the record about Warren Aldridge and what he had actually been. About the revision of a narrative that had shaped 15 years of decisions. The members who had joined after 1989 and knew Cal's disappearance only as chapter history, as the founding tragedy that had defined everything that followed, would need the full telling. Everyone would need the full telling. He thought about Wren. He was going to make certain she was provided for in the way the chapter provided for people it acknowledged as connected to its bloodline. Not loudly, not as a formal declaration, not in any way that required her to carry a label she hadn't asked for, but concretely. The way you provide for someone when you are accepting a debt that was owed to them before they were old enough to know debts existed. This was not a decision he would put to a vote. It belonged to him specifically, in the category of obligations that pass through blood rather than through governance. The sun came over the horizon with the sudden immodest extravagance that Mojave sunrises specialize in, not a gradual warming, but an event, the light arriving fully formed, an enormous flooding across the desert floor, and igniting everything it touched into gold and amber and the deep color of old bronze. The cinder block walls of the Copperhead caught it and held it, and the parking lot gravel went from white to blinding in the space of 30 seconds. Inside, someone had plugged the jukebox back in. It took a moment to cycle through its startup, a hum and a series of mechanical clicks, and then it found the track it had been interrupted on hours ago, and Merle Haggard's voice came back into the Copperhead, where it had been before all of this began. The same slow, aching song about wrong turns and the difficulty of finding your way back to the things that matter, as though the machine had been waiting all night to finish what it had started. Wren heard it. She looked up from wherever she had been, and she looked at the jukebox in the corner, and then she looked around the room, slowly taking in each face in turn, the way she had taken in every face that had ever mattered. The chapter members in their quieter, more internal occupation of the space hatched behind the bar, Bev beside her. She looked at Cord standing in the morning light at the open door, his broad back to the room, looking out at the desert that had kept a secret for 15 years and given it back. She reached up and touched the pendant once with her fingertips. Then she let her hand drop and sat with the silver skull resting openly against her shirt in the bar light, and the new morning light in the Merle Haggard song filling the space around her. And she looked like what she was, a 10-year-old girl at the end of an incomprehensible night, exhausted and sad, and carrying something that was too big for her in some ways, and exactly the right size for her in others. Bev put her arm around her and pulled her close. Cord pushed off the doorframe and walked back across the bar to the corner booth. He stood at the edge of it and looked at Wren. "Your father kept my brother's secret for 15 years, he said. He kept the chapter's money safe. He made sure the truth had somewhere to go when he was no longer able to take it there himself." He paused, finding the right words and taking the time required to find them. "The chapter doesn't forget that kind of thing. You understand what I'm saying?" Wren looked at him with those coffee-colored eyes that missed nothing. "Yes," she said. He nodded once. Then he straightened and walked to the front door of the Copperhead Saloon and stepped out into the morning, his boots on the gravel making the same sound they had made every other time he had ever walked across a parking lot, unhurried and deliberate, and entirely his own. The light was full now, golden and merciless and magnificent, the way Mojave mornings are in July when the heat has not yet arrived, but everything is already lit up like something that has just been told it is allowed to exist. His motorcycle was where he had left it. He stood beside it for a moment with his hand on the handlebar and looked out across the desert that stretched away from the highway in every direction, ancient and patient, in keeping whatever was entrusted to it the way it always had and would. Long after every person in this building was returned to the same earth that had held Iron Cal Mercer faithfully for 15 years and given him back when the time was right. Cal had gone down fighting for the people he loved. He had gone down completely like himself, without compromise or surrender. That was the truth of it. That was what the desert had been holding all this time underneath everything else. That was enough. Inside the Copperhead, Wren Aldridge sat in the corner booth with the silver skull resting openly against her shirt and her aunt's arm around her, and the morning coming through the open door and a long gold bar across the old floor. And for the first time since April, since the hospital room, and the particular quality of relief that had crossed her father's face. When the weight finally left him, she did not feel like something essential was missing. The pendant rose and fell with her breathing. The jukebox played on.